Hello, welcome back to part 2 of the series. My name is Janine and my goal is to share the joy of watercolor with you and show you some hacks to make painting easier. A little backstory in case you missed the last video. I rediscovered some of my childhood art supplies, and in this video I will share with you some valuable hacks on how to use them, as I'm sure many of you are working with similar supplies. This is the second video I made about the paper. If you haven't seen the other one already, I suggest you go back and check it out. In this video I will be painting an easy lavender illustration, first with the cheapest watercolor paper I could find, and then with a paper I used in my childhood. Let's begin. An easy trick to make something appear at a distance is to paint it out of focus. To paint something out of focus, I pre-wet in the background and start to drop in some pigment. If there is more watercolor in the brush, more water will be released onto the paper, bleeding further. You can also control how far the pigment bleeds by dropping it in at different times during the drying process. So I paint those flowers first that are furthest away. The method I'm using here is to dab the brush onto the paper and just let it distribute itself to create beautiful uneven color gradients. Based on what I learned in the last video, I decided that it is best to create an underpainting of sorts, meaning that I will be completing the lavender in 2 layers with some drying time in between. As I will be painting the second layer on dry paper, it will not bleed out as far and the flowers will visually appear closer than the blurry flowers in the background. I also learned that both papers aren't handling it too well when I soak them with water. I therefore concentrate on the center of the paper only. If you're wondering why I'm not taping the paper down, I'm using some tape to keep the paper within the frame of this video. The paper bulges so much that tape would be absolutely pointless, so I'm not taking the risk of ripping the paper later on when I'm removing the tape. For the second paper, my childhood paper, I will use the exact same painting process, but I use less water, as the paper will buckle badly. I will also have all my paints and brushes ready to go, as I learned that this paper dries really fast. I'm adding a hint of blue to the purple lavender flower to give it more variation and keep it interesting. I'm also adding some yellow to the sap green to brighten it up. As you might have noticed, the paints are intentionally not mixed fully to achieve this effect. Just in case you're wondering about the camera angle. While it is true that I'm working with a temporary setup, this was the best angle to show you just how wet the paper is and how much the second paper bulges. I find this far more helpful, especially since I can show you all the painting methods I use with the first paper. Now that you have seen both papers wet and side by side, let's talk art supplies. The paper on the left is the cheapest watercolor paper I could find. The paper on the right is the paper I used when I started my art journey back in school. It is glorified printer paper and basically the standard for schools in my area. Seeing them side by side, the first thing that you will notice is how bad the printer paper on the right buckles. Gravity will allow the watercolor to pool, making the artist's life harder. There are ways around it, but why would we make our own lives harder? I let the background dry and then add another layer. Let's start with the watercolor paper on the left again. I mix some blue into the purple and start dabbing my brush on the paper. It is important here that I leave gaps. The lavender flower I'm painting has a cone shape, and you can draw the stem or even a light outline of the cone with a pencil in advance, if you feel unsafe about the placement or the size. Please do not let ever anyone tell you that light pencil lines are cheating. They are not. They can be your guide to get it right the first time. I still sometimes get carried away and paint the flowers way too big. Cotton paper stays wet a lot longer than the 2 papers I'm using today. With cotton paper, I could just add the dots in a light wash and then drop in blue and purple to create a beautiful play of colors as they bleed into each other. When I'm working with wood pulp paper, I need a different strategy to achieve the same effect. I need to add the other colors now, so I add some of the purple and blue colors in the brush as I pick up the colors. It is hard to see in the video, but there are patches of blue and purple watercolor on the palette when I'm picking up more watercolor. I make sure to always get some of that. When I do not swirl the brush on the palette, the two colors won't mix properly, allowing me to apply them in patches onto the paper. It is a good idea to look at actual vases with flowers before you start painting, as this can help you to plan out where you will position each flower to create a beautiful flower arrangement. Especially when you paint in a more loose style, this can make the difference between a beautiful work of art and a blob of color. For the second flower, I add some more blue to the watercolor mixture, as this will make it easier for the eye to differentiate the two flowers. This variation of color will make the painting more interesting. If you like, you can use other colors instead of blue, for example pink. Once I completed each flower, I use a small brush to pick up some green watercolor and add a stem. Adding the twigs between the purple or blue flowers will allow the green to bleed a little into the purple or blue. This will make the painting more interesting and look tied together. Don't try to add every twig. It is better to leave them out and only add a few. When you add the stem, be careful not to make it too wide. Leaving a gap in the line will look better than painting the stem too wide. Once I painted the flowers, I add some leaves with diluted green watercolor. The method I'm using is simple and has been demonstrated a lot in the past. I load the brush with watercolor and paint a straight line. In the middle of the line, I push down the brush to let the bristles feather out. Easy enough, right? Where to position the leaves can be tricky, and I have two hacks for you. The first one is to never paint too many leaves. I would rather have too few than too many. It is easy for the foliage to overpower the beautiful flowers. The second hack is to make a sketch. Grab a spare piece of paper and outline them with a pencil or even with a watercolor. It will help you to get a visual feeling for how many leaves are needed. And what brush to use? Well, you will fan out the bristles in the process of painting the leaves, so it should be a larger brush. Painting the first leaf, you will soon discover if the brush is too small. If it is, just grab another one and paint over the same leaf again. If you're fast enough, there won't be any watermarks. In my experience, it is far more important to control how much water is soaked up in your brush and released while you paint. As you can see, I sometimes struggle with the positioning of the items on the paper as well. As I tend to make every leaf way too big, I like to use a smaller brush to paint the leaves in 2 strokes instead of 1. If you want to follow my example, please be aware that you need to be fast to get the second stroke down before the painting starts to dry. This can be tricky with some papers. Adding a second stroke can also help you to correct the shape of your leaf. This works best if your leaf was a little on the smaller side before. I also sometimes use the second stroke to simply add more watercolor or pigment. The watercolor is drying really fast, so I can add the next layer. I add some more spots to the flowers, and this time the watercolor is less diluted. This layer is easily visible on the more pale first layer of flowers. The darker spots will appear closer to the viewer, almost adding a 3D look. I leave larger gaps between each dab in this layer than I did before. The goal is not to cover up the first layer, but to add some dark flowers. A larger contrast in color between the first and second layer will add more interest. It is fully up to you how much color variation you want to add, but I like to stick with a mix of blue and purple, as this will make the painting look more cohesive. While the watercolor is still wet, I can always add a little hint of watercolor and let it bleed into the wet paint. Keep in mind that both papers I'm using today dry really fast. So I work fast and might even have to work in sections. Especially the childhood paper on the right dries really fast, and I wish I would have known about working in sections back when I was using this paper. The leaves should be dry now. For the first layer I used a diluted sap green, and there might have been a hint of lemon yellow mixed in it as well. Now for the second layer of leaves, I'm using a much darker hooker's green. Let me show you a trick I used to paint with small amounts of watercolor on fast drying paper. I add the hooker's green and go back in with a brush that has only clean water in it. I paint water on the area of the leaf without hooker's green. When I let the water touch the wet hooker's green, it will bleed into the water, creating a beautiful uneven color gradient. This method is a very safe way to stay in control over how far the watercolor can bleed. On the right, I'm using the childhood paper, which is basically printer paper. Let's see what hacks we can use with this paper to create a painting similar to the one on the left side. For this paper, I'm using the exact same steps and painting methods as before, just with some modifications. These adjustments to the process will help you if you are using really thin paper. Let's talk about the main problem I had with this paper. Adding multiple layers ends in disaster. In part 1 of this video, I tested both papers and came to the conclusion that adding multiple layers is just not working. The second layer will dry uneven and leave watermarks and blooms really easy. But adding multiple layers is an essential method in painting with watercolors and is always a great method to create dimension and makes the whole painting interesting. Sometimes you encounter paper with similar properties by accident, or you end up using similar paper for a variety of reasons, like painting with the kids during a craft project. I have 4 tips for you to make this paper work. Number 1. I will try to use less water overall to avoid letting the paper get wavy. The explanation behind this is easy. The waving occurs due to the changes in the surface tension when paper becomes wet. An easy solution is to avoid using large amounts of water. This will tie in with point number 3, which I will give you in a minute. Water control is so important, especially when you work with thinner paper. Things are much easier when you are aware at all times how much watercolor is in your brush and how much the brush will release at a time. Try using a smaller brush if you're having trouble with adding too much water. You will have to reload it more often, but you won't have to tackle puddles on the paper. Let me give you an example of how you could adjust your painting method to avoid working with a lot of water. Sometimes I like to pre-wetten a section of the painting to ensure that no hard lines are forming. When working with thinner paper, I will simply avoid this as much as possible, or only pre-wetten the edges of the most recent brush strokes. Let's move on to the second tip. Cover the unevenness. Once your first layer is dry, you sometimes discover blooms and dried puddles of watercolor. You can cover these up with another layer to distract from the patterns. When using watercolor, lifting is the first method I think about when I see an area which came out different than intended. When you try to reactivate the watercolor and then try to lift it, the chances are high that you will destroy the paper in the process as it is so thin. When working with watercolor paper, you sometimes can be able to lift or at least loosen the pigment enough to redistribute it, making the blooms and patterns less visible. When working with thin paper, you can let the paint dry and then add another layer. For this to work, the watercolor in this layer needs to be completely dry, and the next layer of watercolor needs to be darker than the watercolor that's already on the paper. My third tip is about what you paint. Pick your subject right. When the paper limits my ability to paint, I try to pick a subject where I can work with the paper and never against it. The lavender I picked today is a great choice because it has a very uneven and patchy look to it. Uneven drying is less obvious and just adds interest. If I attempted to paint a gradient with this paper, like a sunset, it would fail. A full-page sunset would be a terrible choice due to the uneven drying. Choosing a subject that has multiple small areas will work great. For example, a flower with many petals, or even a comic figure. The fourth and final tip is to embrace the patchiness. Sometimes you can just work with the patchy drying instead of trying to fix it. For example, I know the leaves in this painting will come out patchy and I work to integrate this, as it adds interest. Consistency is key. When you decide to embrace it, you need to stick with it. In order to make this look work, you cannot pick to fix or even out some areas and not others. You need to be committed to sticking with the results you get at the first try. Embracing the look means that it needs to look the same on every leaf, making it appear unified and intentional. The paper I'm using today as an adult for watercolor paintings has a thickness of 300 grams per square meters. The paper I was using in my childhood was only 100 grams per square meters, or even less. Not everyone needs to immediately invest in expensive cotton paper, but using at least watercolor paper will make a big difference and avoid frustrations. The cheap watercolor paper I'm using in this video is not great, but you can clearly see the difference on how it handles water. I hope that you found this video interesting and find the hacks useful. I like to make these videos as they give me the opportunity to reflect back and learn something about myself from previous mistakes. Looking back at the old paper I used, for example, allows me to analyze what I could have done better, and I can definitely learn from that. I now feel more confident in handling any paper I encounter with ease. Over the years, I grew as an artist, and maybe the most important lesson I learned about working with different types of paper is to always work with the paper and never against it. The most I have to lose is 10 minutes time and a sheet of paper. Thank you so much for watching the video. I hope you liked it. Please hit the like button and subscribe to my channel. I will see you soon with the next video.